On September 11th, 2001, it was my last week of filling in as lead pastor for Kent Millard, who was on sabbatical. I remember exactly where I was. I was still in bed watching Matt Lauer when I witnessed that first plane. It took a little while to remember that I was the acting lead pastor of a very large church. But soon I was on the phone with one of my colleagues, and before you knew it, we were all together with the music team and with the staff of St. Luke's United Methodist Church. We tried to find out how we move forward. We opened up the doors of the church and prepared the sanctuary for people to gather, and people did start gathering. They started coming in and simply in silence. That evening, we were the first to plan a service for the community, and I worked very hard that afternoon on a message. It just so happened that I had to go in to do a microphone check before the service started, and I looked out, and there I saw police officers and firefighters and the members of our community. The place was packed. I knew that the message I had prepared was not the message we needed. And in a moment's notice, I don't know where it came from, it had to be God, I picked up a hymnal, I threw it at Bob Zare, and I said, "Would you play this for me?" Because that's all I could think of. That we needed our hands held in the midst of this dark and awful situation. We needed to experience the love of God in and among one another as we held one another's hands, for there were no words. It was only later that I learned the history of this amazing hymn. It was written by Thomas Dorsey in 1932, and it's loosely based on Psalm 73, a psalm that reads, Yet you are always with me. You hold my hand. You guide me with counsel. And afterwards I know you will lead me to your glory. See, the hymn was written during a very dark time in Dorsey's life. It was written after a crushing experience. For in August of 1932, Dorsey had traveled from Chicago to St. Louis to sing and play a revival, leaving behind his pregnant wife, Nettie. While he was there sharing in the program, he received a telegram with a message that said, "Your wife just died." Shortly after he returned home, the baby boy she had given birth to also died. As Dorsey described it later, he said, "I fell apart. I was lost in pain and grief like none I had ever experienced before." It was only when his friend, a professor, Professor Fry, came and took him physically from his home to go out and have a meal did he have a little bit of understanding that he was loved by someone else. It just so happened that the professor needed to stop. He was a music teacher, stopped by the school on his way out for the meal, and Dorsey just went and sat at the piano. And he said, "Suddenly, it wasn't me. There was something else in my hands that were browsing across the keys, and something happened to me. I felt a peace, that peace that passes all understanding. I felt as though God had reached out and touched me." The melody was one that was common in his Sunday school growing up, but the words were all new. He said, "The Lord gave me these words in the melody. He also healed my spirit in that moment." I learned that when we are in our deepest grief, when we feel the farthest from God, this is when God desires to be closest to us. And when we are open to being restored by God's power, then indeed we are restored by a miraculous spirit and energy beyond our understanding. It is only then that we recognize that this is only a portion of the goodness of life we will someday share in, which he refers to as God's glory. I give thanks that God in some way worked on that 9/11 experience in my life in a similar way. To witness and experience the grief of so many people. We had no words, but we did have each other. You know, it's often in these dark experiences that we lead ourselves to ask that question, why? Why do these things happen? I have to admit, in the message I had created, I was trying to address the why. But the truth about life is, there isn't an answer to that question. We don't know what was in the minds of those 19 men. We don't know what came together to create the greatest disaster in our nation's soil, on our soil in history. We cannot answer that question, why? So how do we do it? We're left with answering the question of how. And what I experienced that night was we did do the how pretty well. See, we came together in the midst of grief when we did not understand what was happening. We came together and we had a willingness, as that opening song said, to grab the hand of a stranger and be reminded that we are in this together. To be reminded indeed that God loves us. And we experience that love through holding one another's hands. See, we're what God has. Today, I give thanks and I am mindful of each and every one of you and how on a regular basis we often forget that we need each other on this journey. But then indeed, if something happens that is overwhelming, we will come together in our grief and we will take one another's hands. And we will lead one another through the darkness, not by our will, but by God's will. I'm reminded on this day that not only do we have one another, but we have the memory of those 3,000 lives that were lost on that day, and those who have died in a call for peace and justice since. If you've never been to the 9/11 Memorial, I encourage you to go because it is indeed a life-changing experience. In that memorial, you will find a coroner's office. The New York coroner has an office in the 9/11 Memorial. Why is it that there is that coroner's office there? Well, because in that very space are the remains of many. In that very space, there are remains that have yet to be identified and may never be identified. In that space, we have a legal responsibility to remember those who have gone before. When you stand in that place, you not only remember your pain and loss, but you are remembered with those people who have gone before us. For they live in the very soil and foundation of that place. And you are touched by their eternal lives. You remember, you think, and you remember the spirit of those who have gone before. On the wall there, it says, "No day shall erase you from the memory of time." That's a quote by Virgil. Today we remember those who have gone before, those who lost their life 15 years ago, and we remember them into our community, being mindful when we take one another's hands, we honor their spirit. Being mindful when we take one another's hands, we are holding the hand of God. And together, even in the midst of the darkness and the loss and the pain, God is with us. Our final story today is from Kevin, and I just simply want to thank the band for their courage, all the different folks who have shared their stories today, their courage to share those stories. You know, as musicians, we often are hidden behind our instruments, and I give thanks that God allowed you guys to share your thoughts with us today.